I'm going to speak tonight about my new book, Why Leaders Lie, The Truth About Lying in International Politics. And let me start by telling you how I became interested in the subject. In the spring of 2003, Serge Schmemann, who then wrote for the New York Times, was doing a piece for the Sunday Week in Review section on international lying. And he called me up and he said that for some reason, when thinking about the subject, my name popped into his head. I had never met him before, but he asked me what were my thoughts about international lying. And I said to him, I've never thought about the subject before. And I said, as best as I can recall, there's no literature on it. So I said, why don't you tell me what you're thinking about it, and then I'll bounce off your ideas. So we talked for about an hour and had a very fruitful discussion about international lying. And after I hung up the telephone, I made some notes and I stuck them in a folder. A few months later, MIT asked me if I'd come and give a talk, and they said I could talk on any subject I wanted. So I said, what the heck, I'll talk about international lying. So I pulled out my notes, and over the next week or two, I crafted a talk, went to MIT and gave it. And what I found was that people were fascinated by the subject. And then I gave more talks, and everywhere I went, I found that people were fascinated by the subject. So I eventually wrote a paper, and then I decided to turn the paper into a short book. And that's how I ended up writing the book I'm going to talk about tonight. Now, the key premise in the book is that lying sometimes makes strategic sense. It sometimes makes good sense for the leaders of a particular country to lie. Lying is a useful tool of statecraft, in my argument. Now, in the beginning of the book, I distinguish between selfish lies and strategic lies. Selfish lies are lies that leaders tell that are designed to benefit them. Strategic lies are lies that leaders tell to benefit the country. And let me give you an example that's actually quite controversial that illustrates this division. In the book, I talk about 4 lies that the Bush administration told in the run-up to the Iraq War. And I make the argument that the Bush administration did not tell those lies for selfish reasons. None of the individuals in the administration who lied were going to benefit from those lies personally. They told those lies because they thought it was in the American national interest to go to war against Iraq. As you all know, or as hopefully all of you know, that was a boneheaded decision. But nevertheless, they thought they were doing the right thing. And they waged this deception campaign for what they thought were positive ends. It's also important to emphasize that I talk about noble lies in the book. I make the argument that there are some lies that our leaders have told over time, which I think can be categorized as noble lies. And the best example is the lying that President Kennedy did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In that crisis, Nikita Khrushchev, who was his counterpart on the Soviet side, told Kennedy that he would take the Soviet missiles out of Cuba, provided that Kennedy take the Jupiter missiles, the American Jupiter missiles, out of Turkey. As almost all of you know, Turkey is right next door to the Soviet Union, and those Jupiter missiles looked to the Soviets a lot like the Soviet missiles in Cuba looked like us, and Khrushchev wanted them out. Actually, Kennedy had no problem taking them out, because when he had assumed the office of the presidency in January 1961, he had ordered the Pentagon to take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey. He didn't want the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. but the Pentagon had failed to take the Jupiter missiles out. So he was, not worried for strategic reasons about those missiles being removed from Turkey. But he felt that if the American public found out about the deal, he would have to renege on the deal. And he also felt that if the Europeans, especially the Turks, found out about the deal, they would think that the United States' commitment to defend Europe was not very firm, and that America was willing to compromise Europe's security to maximize America's security. So Kennedy told Khrushchev, we have a deal, but you cannot announce that we have that deal. And if you do announce that we have that deal, I will deny it. And furthermore, if someone here in the United States smells that a deal has been made and starts asking questions, you want to understand that I'm going to lie about it. Needless to say, a number of journalists and others smelled the deal and started asking questions about whether or not Kennedy had agreed to trade the Jupiters for the Soviet missiles in Cuba. And Kennedy lied and said there was no such deal. And when I was young, I believed, as did almost everybody else who studied the Cuban Missile Crisis, that there had been no deal and that Kennedy had stood his ground and insisted that Khrushchev take the missiles out without a quid pro quo. But we were wrong because he had lied to us. I'm glad he lied to us, and I'm glad they cut the deal because it ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the United States came to war during the Cold War. And given that both sides had thermonuclear weapons and there was a chance that a war would have escalated to the nuclear level, I think it was imperative that President Kennedy shut down that crisis. And if he had to tell a lie to the American people and to the Europeans to do it, so be it. So my argument is that there's a distinction between strategic lies and selfish lies. And what I'm talking about tonight is strategic lies. And I'm also making the argument that sometimes those lies turn out to be noble lies. This is not to say that sometimes those lies don't turn out to be blunders. And again, I did reference the Bush administration and its deception campaign in the run-up to the Iraq War. Now, what exactly do I mean when I'm talking about lying? It's important to get the definitions down. My basic schema looks like this. There's truth-telling on one side, and there's deception on the other side. And underneath deception, there's lying, spinning, and concealment. And I'll walk you through the definitions of all of those. But you want to understand that at the highest level, there's a distinction between truth-telling and deception. Truth-telling is where an individual goes to great lengths to tell a story in a straightforward manner and in as truthful a way as possible. Deception, of course, is the opposite. And among the three kinds of deception, lying usually means saying something that is not true. If Jenna asked me, did I go to Kansas City yesterday? And I said no, when in fact I did go to Kansas City yesterday, that would be a lie. But there's actually another form of lying. And that comes when a person does not make one statement or a series of statements that are untrue, but nevertheless makes a series of statements that are designed to lead the listener to a false conclusion. So you're purposely deploying your statements, and none of those statements by themselves are false. You're purposely deploying those statements to lead the listener to a false conclusion. That's different than actually saying something that you know to be untrue. And let me give you an example for each one of those kinds of lying, again, going to the Bush administration and the run-up to the Iraq War. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld said, on September 27th, 2002. He said that we have, quote unquote, bulletproof evidence of a link between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. Approximately 2 years later, on October 4th, 2004, he told the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, quote, "To my knowledge, I have not seen any strong, hard evidence that links the two." That's a lie. It's a bold-faced lie. An example of the second kind of lying has to do with the argument that the Bush administration made that Saddam was in part responsible for September 11th. When we went to war in March of 2003, well over half of the American people believed that Saddam was in part responsible for September 11th. This was because the Bush administration went to enormous lengths to convince you that that was the case. They never said, however, that Saddam was directly responsible for what happened on September 11th, but they made a series of statements over time that were designed to make you believe that Saddam helped perpetrate September 11th. So those are the two kinds of lying. Then there's concealment and spinning. Concealment is where you simply don't tell the other party about certain facts. And again, to go to the run-up to the Iraq War. And again, to focus on the link between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. We interrogated both Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the principal architect of the attacks, and Abu Zubaydah, and both of them told us in separate engagements that Saddam and Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with each other, and in fact, they intensely disliked each other. The Bush administration, not surprisingly, concealed that information from us because the Bush administration wanted to give us the impression that the two of them were joined at the hip. But that's concealment, it's not lying. The third form of deception, which we all engage in our daily lives, is spinning. Spinning is where you don't tell an outright lie, you just arrange the facts in a story to present yourself in a most positive light, or to present an issue that you care about in the most positive light. You leave out the negative parts, or you downplay the negative parts. When a boy and a girl flirt with each other, they engage in spinning. If President Obama were up here and we asked him, what's the state of the American economy? He would engage in spinning. He would tell us all the positive aspects of the economy. He would downplay the negative or conceal the negative aspects. If John Boehner, on the other hand, were up here and we asked him, he'd paint a very different picture, but he too would spin. Neither President Obama nor Mr. Boehner would lie. They would spin. So you have these three forms of deception, and I would argue that we all engage in spinning and concealment frequently. And in fact, there's no way that a society could work without a great deal of spinning and concealment. But lying, on the other hand, is a different matter. If somebody said that one of the real problems with John Mearsheimer is that he's a liar, that would bother me greatly. If all of you thought that I was a liar, that would not sit well with me. If you think that I'm misguided, well, I can live with that. But being called a liar is not something that most people cotton to. So, given that lying is such a special category of deception, I figured it made a lot of sense to think about how it applied to international politics. Now, what I discovered is that there are five kinds of international lies. And let me tell you what the five kinds of lies are. The first kinds of lies are interstate lies. Interstate lies are where the leader of one country lies either to the leader of another country or to a foreign audience. And let me give you a good example of that. During the Cold War, the United States was very interested in convincing the Soviet Union that we would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe, were the Soviets to attack into Western Europe. And this is in large part because the threat of nuclear use by the United States was a wonderful way of deterring the Soviets from attacking in the first place. If the Soviets thought that we were going to use nuclear weapons and a conventional war in Europe would therefore likely escalate to the nuclear level, they would never start such a war. So we had a vested interest in convincing the Soviets that we would use those nuclear weapons. Of course, it was not clear that we would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe, because if the Soviets were overrunning Western Europe, as bad as that would be, it's nowhere near as bad as a general thermonuclear war that ends up in the United States getting incinerated. So there were all sorts of reasons to think we wouldn't use the nuclear weapons, which of course is why our leaders went to great lengths to say we would use nuclear weapons. Henry Kissinger and Robert McNamara both said when they were in positions of power that they would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe. Both of them later said that they would have never used nuclear weapons to defend Europe. And when they made those statements, they were bluffing. Bluffing, by the way, is a euphemism for lying. They were bluffing. I think it made eminently good sense for them to bluff because it helped make deterrence work in Europe during the Cold War. But the key point is they are admitting that they were lying. So interstate lying is the first kind of lying. Second kind of lying is fear-mongering. A euphemism for fear-mongering might be threat inflation. Fear-mongering is where a leader lies to his or her own public. It's very different than lying to another country. What the Bush administration did in the run-up to the Iraq War is an example of fear-mongering. The Bush administration understood full well that the American public was not enthusiastic about fighting a war against Iraq. So they felt that what they had to do was make it clearer than the truth, to borrow Dean Acheson's words, that Saddam Hussein was so dangerous that he had to be removed from power. And in the process, they told 4 separate lies. And more generally, they waged a deception campaign. And I, of course, have pointed out a number of those lies already. That's fear-mongering. And there are other examples as well. Lyndon Johnson, some of us in the audience are old enough to remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, where Johnson lied about what the North Vietnamese were doing in the Gulf of Tonkin early in August 1964, because he wanted to get a resolution through Congress that basically gave him carte blanche to wage the Vietnam War. That's fear-mongering. A third kind of lying is what I call strategic cover-ups. A good example of a strategic cover-up is President Kennedy lying about the deal that he cut with Nikita Khrushchev to end the Cuban Missile Crisis. What Kennedy was doing was employing a very controversial policy. He made a very important and controversial policy decision that he could not afford to tell the American people and the Europeans about. So he covered it up. He lied. That's what I call a strategic cover-up. It's the third kind of lying. Fourth kind of lying is nationalist myth-making. All states are infected with nationalism. And nationalism invariably involves telling lies about your past. What all countries do is engage in myth-making. They tell stories that portray themselves as the good guys and portray the other as the bad guys. We're all familiar with this process. The example I like to use, because it affected me at one point in time, has to do with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. When I was young, I believed, and virtually everyone I knew believed, that the reason the Palestinians left what became Israel in 1948 was because the Arab leaders told them to leave, because they were then going to come in and murder all the Jews, and then the Palestinians could move back into their homes, and there would be no Jews left because the Arab armies would have finished all of them off. So in effect, it was the Palestinians' own fault for listening to the Arabs and leaving their homes and going outside of mandatory Palestine and creating the problem of all these refugees. We now know, mainly through the work of Israeli historians, that this is not what happened. In fact, there's not a shred of evidence that that's what happened. What happened is that the Israelis ethnically cleansed Palestine. They pushed about 700,000 Palestinians out, and then they would not allow them to return to their homes. This is a nationalist myth. And the United States and all sorts of other countries have similar myths. I'm not picking on Israel here. Israel is not an exception in this regard. But this is nationalist myth-making. Then the final kind of line, international line, is liberal lies. We have today, around the world, a well-established body of norms regarding how to think about war, how to think about when it's permissible to go to war, how to think about what is permissible in the conduct of war, and so forth and so on. And these norms are very closely aligned with basic just war theory. So when states go out and misbehave or act in ways that violate the laws of war, they invariably go to great lengths to try and cover up what they did and portray it in a very different manner. My favorite two liberal lies involve, first of all, the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front in World War II and British bombing policy in that same conflict. Just with regard to the Wehrmacht, when World War II ended, the United States found itself in a very interesting position. During the war, we were allied with the Soviet Union, fighting against Germany. During the Cold War, which followed World War II, we were aligned with Germany, fighting against the Soviet Union. We switched partners, and we switched adversaries. All of this is to say, we effectively jumped into bed with a lot of people who had been key players in what is probably the most murderous regime in modern history. And because the Germans were so important for creating military power in the center of Europe during the Cold War, we had to clean them up. So we, working in conjunction with the Germans, cooked up the myth that the Wehrmacht, the German military, in particular the German army, had virtually nothing to do with all the murder and mayhem on the Eastern Front in World War II. The Wehrmacht, we argued at the time, and I of course believed this, had clean hands. And it was only the Einsatz group and the special police forces and so forth and so on that were involved in the killing that took place on the Eastern Front. Indeed, that was not true at all. It was a lie. The Wehrmacht was inextricably bound up in the German killing machine on the on the Eastern Front, and the Wehrmacht did not have clean hands, it had filthy hands. But given that we needed the Wehrmacht, or the remnants of the Wehrmacht, to create the Bundeswehr, we had to tell ourselves and tell others a story that was comprised of lies. And then the other case involves Bomber Harris. In the spring of 1942, the British were desperate, and they thought the only card they had to play against Germany was to use their military, their air force, to bomb civilian areas in Germany and kill as many German civilians as possible. But of course, the British did not want to advertise to the world that they were purposely murdering civilians, which of course is what they were doing. They were murdering civilians. It's clearly against the laws of war and international norms to purposely kill civilians. But that's what the British were doing under Bomber Harris. So what did the British do? They lied. They said that they were bombing military targets and they were bombing economic targets. And they were not targeting civilians, when in fact they were targeting civilians. That's a liberal lie. So the 5 kinds of lies I see are interstate lies, where leaders lie to foreign audience, fear-mongering, where leaders lie to their own public to inflate a threat, strategic cover-ups, again, President Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, nationalist myth-making, this is countries inventing stories about their founding, for example, to make them look like the good guys and others look like the bad guys, and then liberal lies, which I just talked about. So those are the 5 kinds of lying. Now, what are the 2 main findings in the book? First main finding is that there is not much interstate lying. I was actually shocked to discover this. I thought, as a card-carrying realist and a cynic about international politics, that I would find an abundance of cases of leaders lying to foreign audiences. I figured that diplomats lied all the time to each other. And there are actually famous quotes that make those kinds of arguments. That's not true. I found it very difficult to find examples of interstate lying. And all of those examples that I have in the book, I worked very hard to accumulate. What's very interesting is I'd go around and talk about this subject to audiences like this, and I would tell people that there's very little interstate lying. And I was always surprised at how cynical the audiences were, because people would invariably say to me, this can't be true. There has to be a ton of lying out there. And then I would say to my interlocutors, look, go home, think about the list of cases for the next couple days, then send me an email. I'd give them a card. Send me an email with all the lies, okay? And invariably, I'd get a response a week or so later, and the person would say, all I could think of were 3 lies, and here they are. And usually 2 of them would not be lies, and the 3rd one would be a case I already had. Another cut at this, I would go talk to audiences, and someone would say, are you going to tell me that Saddam Hussein didn't lie? Are you going to tell me that Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, has not lied to us? Are you going to tell me that the North Koreans didn't lie to us? And I always say to people, well, if they did lie, please show me where they lied. And nobody can come up with an example. I cannot find an example of where Saddam Hussein lied. And I'll say more about this in a minute. This is not to say Saddam Hussein was a good guy or Ahmadinejad is a good guy. The question is, did they lie to us? And I can't find any evidence. And again, people just don't believe this. They're remarkably cynical. It's not just old John, the realist, who's cynical. Then my second finding is that leaders seem to lie much more often to their own publics than to other countries. And fear-mongering in the American case is especially prevalent. For those of you who have any doubts about this, there's a book by Eric Alderman, who writes for The Nation. He's a very fine historian who's written a book on presidential lying. It's a remarkable book in that it's so depressing because it's so filled with cases of our leaders lying to us. Just to tell you a story about the book. In the beginning of the book, I tell the story about Saddam. When we didn't discover weapons of mass destruction, many people argued that the reason that happened was that Saddam bluffed us. He bamboozled us. Saddam pretended that he had weapons of mass destruction when in fact he didn't. And that's why we were fooled into thinking that he had WMD. And supposedly, the evidence to support this claim is in the Dulfer report. I looked at the Dulfer report. The Dulfer report does make that claim, but there's no evidence in the Dulfer report to back up that claim. And in fact, all the evidence shows that Saddam claimed that he had no WMD and that he was not lying. There's no evidence that he was bluffing. And if anybody can find any evidence, I would appreciate it if they would give it to me. I've talked to all sorts of people. So Saddam didn't lie to us in the run-up to the Iraq War or throughout the 1990s. But President Bush did lie to us in the run-up to the Iraq War. And this is consistent with my two main findings, that leaders don't lie to other leaders very often, but leaders lie to their own public. Now, the question you want to ask yourself, and really this is the $64,000 question, is why is this the case? Why did I find that there's not much interstate lying, and there's actually quite a bit of lying by leaders to their domestic publics? I think the key variable is trust. There is not a lot of trust in international politics. And if there's not a lot of trust, it's difficult to lie. States tend not to trust each other. Remember Ronald Reagan's famous dictum when he was dealing with the Soviet Union? Trust but verify. Just think about those words. Trust but verify. What Reagan was saying, you can't trust the Soviets. We have to verify that they will stick to the various arms control agreements that we are signing or negotiating. And of course, the Soviets felt the same way. They wouldn't trust us. The Chinese and the Americans today and down the road don't trust each other, especially when important security issues are on the table. They don't trust each other. They prefer to verify. They want some good reason to believe that the Americans will stick to an agreement, and we want some good reason to think that the Chinese will stick to an agreement. States don't trust each other very much. When it comes to domestic politics, the opposite's the case. Publics tend to trust their leaders. After all, our leaders are tasked with the mission of protecting us. They're part of the same tribe that we're in. We expect them to look out for our welfare. There's trust there that doesn't exist among states. Just to give you a good example to highlight this, J. William Fulbright, who was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and a very powerful senator, and who was very skeptical about Vietnam, but nevertheless helped President Johnson push through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, despite his skepticism about Vietnam. He said afterwards, the biggest lesson I learned from Vietnam is not to trust government statements. I had no idea until then. Get that? The biggest lesson I learned from Vietnam is not to trust. There's the key word, trust. I like to tell the story that in the run-up to the Iraq War, I heard Scott Ritter, who was a weapons inspector, talk about the presence of WMD in Iraq. And after listening to Ritter talk, I was convinced that Iraq did not have WMD. He was so knowledgeable and so convincing I said, he's got to be right. A few weeks later, I heard Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld say that we know that Iraq has WMD because we know where they are. And I said to myself, the Secretary of Defense wouldn't say that if he didn't know where they are, right? So maybe Scott Ritter was making a good faith effort in giving us his assessment of the situation, but I think he's probably just wrong, and Rumsfeld obviously has access to information that Ritter does not have access to, and he wouldn't lie to us in such a bold-faced way. So I changed my mind, and I then went about telling people that there was good reason to think that he did have WMD, when in fact, of course, he didn't, and Rumsfeld was lying to us. But you see, in my case, as in Fulbright's case, and this may have been true of many of you, we trusted our leaders. And it's really hard for a country to function well if nobody trusts their leaders, right? So it's that presence of trust that makes lying to one's public much easier to pull off than lying to another country where there tends not to be a whole heck of a lot of trust. Now, I want to make two sets of comments in conclusion. First of all, I have basically argued up to now that there are real virtues to telling lies, selective lies in international politics. I've even made the case that it sometimes makes sense for leaders to lie to their own people. However, it is important to understand that there is a real downside to lying. And I think that's especially true when you talk about fear-mongering. Not so much interstate lies, but fear-mongering. And let me tell you what the two real dangers associated with lying are, and then let me talk about how each of those dangers relates to fear-mongering. The two dangers are what I call blowback and backfiring. Now, what exactly is blowback? Blowback is where a leader who lies to his or her public about foreign policy soon finds him or herself lying about domestic politics and fostering what I would call a culture of dishonesty. If a leader feels compelled to lie to the public about a foreign policy threat, what that leader is in effect saying is that the public can't deal with the issue by being told the truth. There's just something wrong with the public. It's either not sophisticated enough, it's too ignorant, or it doesn't care. It could be any one of these reasons. But the public, right, has to be manipulated to do the right thing. That's what fear-mongering is really all about. As you surely understand, it's not a giant leap to go from making that kind of calculation about foreign policy to making the same calculation about domestic policy and lying to your public on both fronts. And that fosters a culture of dishonesty, in my opinion, and it is very dangerous because there's no way that a society can function well if dishonesty is rampant. So that's blowback. The other downside to international lying is backfiring. And fear-mongering is a case where backfiring is likely to happen. Backfiring is where the lie doesn't work the way you intended it to work, or the policy that the lie helps create doesn't work. And look at what happened with the Bush administration. The Bush administration waged a deception campaign in the run-up to the Iraq War. They were successful at bamboozling large chunks of the American people. They got their war, but the war was a disaster. What that tells me is that the reason they couldn't tell us the truth, the reason they had to wage a deception campaign, was because their ideas about Iraq were wrong-headed to begin with. If they had told us the truth, we wouldn't have had a war, and we wouldn't have had this disaster. The reason they had to lie, the reason that they had to wage a deception campaign in the run-up to the Iraq War was because they were pursuing a boneheaded policy. The fact that they couldn't tell us the truth and get us to go along was evidence that the policy was wrong-headed. Same thing is true with Lyndon Johnson in the run-up to the Vietnam War, with regard to the Gulf of Tonkin incident in particular. The reason President Johnson had to distort the truth was because if he didn't do that, he wouldn't have gotten permission to wage the Vietnam War. And of course, the Vietnam War was an even greater disaster than the Iraq War. So in both cases, although President Johnson and company and President Bush and company told lies to the American people for what they thought were good strategic reasons, and they were successful at getting us into those two wars, it in the end backfired, and we ended up in disastrous wars. So you see that fear-mongering is a very dangerous way of doing business, because it can blow back into the body politic and poison the culture, and furthermore, it can lead to policies that ultimately fail. Finally, let me just say in conclusion that the countries that fear-monger the most are democracies that wage preventive wars against distant threats. Again, the countries in which leaders lie to their publics most often about foreign threats are countries that are democracies that wage preventive wars against distant threats. That, in a nutshell, is the United States of America. Given that the United States seems committed to trying to run the world, given that the United States is a democracy, given that the United States seems committed to using military force liberally, just think about Libya, it seems that we should expect to have lots more evidence of fear-mongering in the years ahead. And therefore, it will probably be the case that when I come back here in 20 years to talk about the new edition of my book, I will reference Eric Alterman's second volume on presidential lying.